Thanks everybody for joining us. Yeah, as you might see, and as people are joining, we're asking folks to just throw in the chat where you're calling in from, if you have a specific reason why you're here. But thanks for joining us. So this is a presentation. We're going to be talking about a little bit about the Vermont Land Trust Farmland Access Program. Just briefly, I'll talk for about 10 minutes about that work and a little bit about kind of the situation right now in Vermont related to land access as a new farmer. And then the focus of the presentation is going to be from Shona and Fran about the White River Land Collaborative and their work on a property in Tunbridge, Vermont that we're in partnership on. So I want to just start out by, given that this presentation is largely focused on land and land acquisition and sort of the idea of land ownership, I think it's important to just acknowledge our place in a colonial land history in the state of Vermont. So this land has been cared for by people other than ourselves for the time before us. And I just want to take time to honor and remember the Native people who took care of this land and came long before me and my ancestors. I live and work on the unceded territory of the Abenaki and the Wabanaki Confederacy. And if you want to learn more about what territory you live on and Native land loss in general, I'd encourage you to check out the website native-land.ca. I'll put it in the chat after I'm done, but it's a great place to look at a map and kind of understand a little bit more about where you live. And the other thing I just want to mention is one of the themes that's going to come up through this presentation is this idea of kind of secure land access and secure land tenure, and really the importance of that for farmers, for agriculture, for land-based businesses in general. And so I just want to acknowledge the immense implications of this work. I don't take this work lightly. I don't take the kind of idea of both land access and control lightly, and what that means for power, for privilege, for sort of wealth generation. And so I think that, land has to be at the center of the conversations around racial equity, food sovereignty, economic prosperity, public health. They're all like intersectional and they're all really tied together. And so for me, I can't really talk about land access without acknowledging that the construct of land ownership has been deployed to dispossess Indigenous people of their land and is tied to ongoing discrimination against Black and Indigenous and other people of color. So I think we have to envision a more equitable farming future, and we have to think about land access not just from the lens of people need places to run businesses and have farms, but the greater implications that come with having the ability to own and control land. So a little bit of framing just for kind of setting the stage with some data. This is always really helpful for me when I'm talking about land access, is to think about kind of what's happening in Vermont right now. So dairy farming in the state of Vermont accounts for about 70% of the gross farm income. So of all the sales of farm products that are happening in the state, 70% of them are coming from dairy. And dairy farms utilize over 80% of the open land. So you can't really think about land access or talk about land access in Vermont without really thinking about dairy farms and the role that they play. There's been about I think it's closer to a 40% reduction in the number of dairy farms in the last 10 years. There was actually just something on VPR that I was listening to right before this that mentioned that statistic, that mainly being small and medium-sized farms. And the farm that we're going to be talking about tonight is a former dairy farm. So these are relevant numbers, former organic dairy. And of Vermont farmers, over 90% of them don't have anyone under 45 who's working for them, and over a third are over the age of 65, so they're aging. We estimate that as many as 300 farms could change ownership between 2020 and 2025, so we're kind of well on our way to that through that 5-year time span. Why does Vermont Land Trust kind of matter in the scope of this conversation? I think this number helps to convey that. Over 20% of Vermont's agricultural land is conserved. And so when you're thinking about land access and you're thinking about the transition of land and the transition of ownership, conservation has a role to play in that, both as a tool during transition, but also just it's you know, we're involved in many of these transfers in one way or another. And land access was a top challenge cited by farmers in the 2017 National Young Farmers Coalition Farmer Survey. I believe that NYFC is doing a new survey that's out right now. So if you are a young farmer who's on this call, I'd encourage you to look up the National Young Farmers Coalition and fill out one of their surveys, because it's really important information for our work and our ability to understand what's kind of going on with young farmers and what they need. So that's kind of like the background, the stage, like the ground in which we're working with, which is, you know, a lot of transition in the dairy industry, you know, land access as a challenge, a lot of transition happening. And then we think about affordability and we think about price. So you can see that the average farm real estate values in the US have been climbing, and are kind of at a high. I don't have the 2022 data here yet, but they increased from $2,010 to an average of $33.80. And this is across the whole country. So in some states, you're looking at like over $16,000 an acre. I think if you look at places like Rhode Island, states like that, they're going to be closer to that $16,000 an acre number. And to just give you a sense, $2,010. So the value in 2007, that's like $2,500 in today's dollars. So sort of taking that into account. And I think, you know, it's really hard for us to understand what the current real estate situation in Vermont is really doing to impact farm prices. I think I'm wary to make any like broad conclusions about that without seeing a lot of data and analyzing that data, which I haven't done. But I think the qualitative evidence that I'm seeing is that, you know, many things that are on the market are highly competitive, prices are increasing. There's a lot of pressure on Vermont real estate in general. And so I do think that's having an impact on farmers' ability to access land and just like increased competition. So, you know, affordability being one challenge that's mentioned there, there's more, it's more than just affordability. So some of the other challenges that beginning farmers face are, you know, if you don't come from a farming background, it's even more difficult because, you know, none of that is going to be sort of handed down to you or given to you, whether it's assets or land, equipment, skills, none of that's going to be kind of given to you at a discounted cost. Increasing land values, finding appropriate land size and infrastructure. So Shona and Fran will talk about this, but I think this project is a really good example of that. Is like, how do we match the types of businesses that farmers want to have today with what's available in terms of what's on the market and the kinds of farm businesses that used to function or that still function here but are in transition. You know, aligning the needs of the seller, or the owner, and the buyer, or the renter. We're seeing sellers have, you know, many have very specific needs in terms of price, in terms of timeline, and it's really challenging as a first-time farm buyer to actually be able to meet that, come up with the right amount of capital, be able to move quickly. A lot of people's first real estate transaction, it's overwhelming. It's like a lot to learn and a lot to try to understand. There's this farm viability piece. So, you know, can you afford the ongoing costs of ownership of a property? Like, does your farm really provide enough income and enough revenue to support that? I think this is a really interesting piece that we see happening a lot in farm transitions where, you know, an older generation may have been able to get on the land for a certain price and, you know, their business is viable due to kind of those overhead costs. And then a younger generation coming in and trying to figure out, like, how can I be viable with higher costs? And so we're seeing a lot of farms in transition needing to grow, needing to diversify, needing to like get into processing, needing to figure out how to find new revenue streams, how to become more profitable. Accessing financing is another challenge. So there's there's many challenges. There's many more than this: student loan debt, childcare. If you're in Vermont, there was a story in 7 Days Today about a farm in Addison County that is shutting down some cheesemakers. And I think it's a really good example of like the confluence of these issues. It's like childcare, housing, affordability. Like it's a really good example of like how all of those things can come together and be really immensely challenging. So here we are at VLT at the Farmland Access Program, trying to think about like, how do we address these like really dynamic, really kind of challenging, overwhelming problems? So we try to focus on connecting farmers with affordable land access opportunities that support local communities, have a focus on local food production, and try to promote the long-term productive use of conserved land. So here's a few farmers that we've worked with over the years. We've done over 100 kind of farmland access projects since the beginning of this work in the early 2000s. And the way in which we do our work, it's not like people kind of enroll in a program and they're in this program for a year and then they leave. We really do our work through using a variety of tools to achieve those outcomes. So we use different tools to achieve those outcomes that were on that previous slide. So some of those tools that we use are the acquisition of new conservation easements and using that as a bridge to provide some capital at the time of transition, updating older easements to add additional restrictions that make it more favorable for farmers, that protect water, that restore wetlands. We do a little bit of matchmaking of already conserved lands. So trying to understand what conserved lands are already out there that are available, and do we, have farmers in our network who we know who could be a good fit. Landowner assistance to identify buyers, so helping landowners promote properties when they're for sale, assistance with land transactions and negotiations, so trying to kind of help farmers understand, like, what does that first time farm purchase look like what is even the process, when do you get a lawyer, when do you go to a lender, all that stuff. And then interim ownership, which is kind of what we're going to focus on with Fran and Shona's presentation as a newer tool for VLT. So our fee ownership of a property in order to create a pathway there. And I just want to acknowledge that like land access is part of, and VLT are part of this shared effort to get the next generation of farmers successfully onto land. So land access is obviously at the core of this, but we work with partners who provide other services that are really important for farmers. So No for Vermont, Land for Good, the Northeast Farmers of Color, Land Trust, the Viability Program, and others that are mentioned here. So we see ourselves as sort of like a virtual organization that provide this kind of wraparound service. And lastly, I'll just say, so this tool of longer term ownership that I mentioned, so VLT actually acquiring properties in fee as we have, and as we do with the farm that Shona and Fran are going to speak about, it provides opportunities for new arrangements and new models. So creative lease arrangements, creative landholding models, deeper affordability tools to explore, and then it comes with the challenges of longer term ownership. So what does it mean for a farmer to be in sort of a lease relationship with an organization like us? What does it mean for us to be in a long-term ownership, or a medium-term or a short-term ownership position in a property in terms of maintenance and liability, and and also really wanting to provide a high level of service and a supportive environment for the farmers that we're working with. So we're developing this program. We're working with awesome partners. We have about 10 farms currently that we own or are in the process of purchasing to create a pathway for a independent farm business or a nonprofit to with a focus on farming to be able to acquire. So it's a strategy that we're excited about and are continuing to learn about. So that's my bit. I'm gonna be quiet now and hand it over to, I think, Fran to start, and I'll be back at the end for some Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, Maggie, and welcome everyone. Maggie, you want to put up the next slide?
Yes, sorry, my computer is just attempting to do it. There we go.
Okay. So I'm Fran Miller. I'm a staff attorney and adjunct faculty at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. And it is really my privilege to serve as the co-director of the White River Land Collaborative. With me today presenting to our project to you, along with her kitty, is Shona Sanford Long, a founder of the Land Collaborative, owner of Flying Dog Farm, and our anchor tenant land steward on the Tunbridge Farm. And Shona and I are going to present the project, but the rest of the project team is here as well. And I want to introduce all of the awesome women leading this effort. Next slide, please. So Sarah is co-director of the Land Collaborative. If you're in Vermont, you may know her as the former network manager at the Farm to Plate Network, and now she is project manager for the White River Valley Consortium and working on housing issues. Suzanne, along with her husband Tim, is the longtime organic farmer behind Luna Blue Farm in South Royalton. And Whitney Shields is my colleague at the Center for Ag and Food Systems, and we are all local community members as well. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start off, Maggie laid out a lot of data and a lot of the issues that are facing farmers in Vermont and more generally as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about the issues we were formed to address, which encompass those. So I'm going to talk about it in a little bit of a different way. There's so many reasons that our country needs to be doing more to support farmers who are farming regeneratively, who are using good ecological practices, who are respecting the land and growing food and animals to feed their communities, us, at an affordable price. This is really a public good, and it should be treated as such, but that's not public policy right now. So we have to try some new things at the local level to support these farmers, to be able to feed us, steward the land, combat climate change, and make a living. As Maggie noted, the cost of land is just a huge barrier for farmers without capital. So can we create a model of community-based ownership so that a retiring farmer can sell their land to a community-based entity that then leases the land to farmers with limited financial resources? As many of you know, and as Maggie just laid out, in Vermont and other places around the country, dairy farmers that don't run industrial dairies in the Midwest have been hit pretty hard economically. And landholding dairies tend to be large parcels of land with a lot of infrastructure. That statistic that Maggie said, that dairies cover 80% of open lands in Vermont, that's huge. How do we create models of land ownership so that if they wish, dairy farmers can sell their land to other types of farmers for a price that compensates them for their investments? Can we create models so that multiple agricultural enterprises can operate on a single parcel in a collaborative and equitable way using good practices? And then last but not least, how do we as a state with a large majority of white people living on unceded Abenaki territory act on our core values of equity and justice and redress past injustices stemming from racism and land theft? And so we created the White River Land Collaborative to help address these and other issues. Our model builds off previous community land trust models that were created to hold agricultural land in a commons to be managed by local community. And we see this as a project that's hopeful in a time where there's just a lot of despair. And thankfully, Vermont Land Trust thinks so too. And the farm in Tunbridge that's pictured here is our first project. We are hopeful that we can incorporate additional land into this commons model that we're implementing. Next slide, please. So Shona's going to talk about the land that we're on and its importance. But first, just a quick note about the model. I keep using this word model. This is the model of land ownership that we're creating. So you might know there's different types of land trusts. Many of you know that Vermont Land Trust is a conservation land trust. Its mission has been, at least so far, to make sure farm and forest land is protected from subdivision and development and is protected for future generations. And as Maggie said, there's some more VLT is working on to do more than that even. And what it's done on the protection side is great, 21%, as Maggie said, of land in Vermont. Another type of land trust is a community land trust, which generally are community-based organizations. They've primarily been used to promote affordable housing. We plan for White River Land Collaborative to be a hybrid. It will be a community land trust that holds agricultural land. We're taking land off the real estate market and so limiting land speculation and development. We're allowing the local community a say in what happens on the land, and we're offering long-term, secure, and equitable tenure to local farmers using ecological farming practices that respect the land. Yeah, you can go ahead, Maggie. I think it's important to give credit to those who came before and created some of these models. I want to especially highlight New Communities and Fannie Lou Hamer Freedom Farms, both of which were created during the Civil Rights Movement and were really impactful as places engaged with agriculture, respecting the land, and safe havens for civil rights activists during those times. Next slide, please. So I'm proud to say that the activities that we're engaged in reflect our core values. We are reducing barriers to land access. We are fostering ecological stewardship. We are collaborating with our local Abenaki community. We are integrating our landscape with solar, building a healing relationship with the land, and we hope to inspire more community-based ownership models in Vermont and beyond. And we'll talk about a couple of specific projects a little bit later in the presentation. But first, we're going to talk about the land. So next slide, please. We're going to hear from Shona, one of our founders, owner of Flying Dog Farm, and as I said, our anchor tenant collaborator, who will talk about the specifics of the land we're operating on, her fledgling livestock operation, and some of the possibilities she sees as a farmer leader of this project. Shona.
Thanks, Fran, and thanks, Maggie, for getting us all started. Hopefully this little cat isn't too distracting. So I'm going to share more about the property itself, and I'm going to start off with just a bit about myself, since that kind of leads into how this all came about here. Maggie, if you want to just switch to the next slide. This is just a view of the farm, the property we're in now, and I'll get more into that as I go along. So I grew up right down the road from this farm. It's about an 8-minute drive on my parents' diversified vegetable and livestock farm, Luna Blue. I didn't necessarily think I was going to end up farming as a career later on, but I left for college, studied biology at Middlebury, and then ended up going back into farming, worked on different farms around the country, a butcher shop in Brooklyn and a cattle ranch out in New Mexico. And after 4 years of doing that, decided to move back to my family's farm here in South Royalton with my husband, Hugo, in 2018. In the spring of 2020, we decided to buy the beef cattle, pigs, and sheep that my parents had been raising to start my own farm, the Flying Dog Farm. And we can get more into farm transfer and family farming, but they had been raising vegetables and livestock on a fairly small acreage and being very diversified. And it didn't make sense for me to try to take all that on in that way. I was really more interested in the livestock. But it also didn't make sense for me to try to do the livestock just on their property. The acreage that they own is fairly small, only about 15 acres of pasture. And so to build a standalone livestock business on that acreage just wasn't economically viable. And the first year I was based on their farm, and I was grazing also a few different parcels of pasture owned by other landowners in the area. And I knew that I was going to need access to a bigger piece of pasture, you know, whether owned or leased. But I didn't have capital to invest in purchasing farmland. I think especially for young farmers who, you know, either maybe have grown up on a farm or have been working on farms, it can be very hard to be making enough money in any of those jobs to put any money towards saving to starting your own farm. So I think that's kind of an important piece. Anyone wanting to start a farm from a career in farming, it can be a lot more difficult than trying to start a farm, you know, after a different career where maybe you have a little bit more income. So this all started to come about in November of 2020 when a friend of mine told me that Corey and Ann Chapman were selling this farm. And it was actually kind of a difficult thing to find out because my family knew Corey and Ann. They weren't old farmers that had been farming their whole life and were just ready to retire. They had made a very difficult decision to sell this farm. So it wasn't the happiest of news, but because of the proximity to my family's property, the acreage, and the quality of the soils, it was something that I felt like I really needed to find out more about, because there's not a lot of available properties of any size acreage in this area, and for a livestock farm, that's kind of an important piece. So this photo is a photo of the farm. Just to clarify, what in this photo, there's actually two properties. So the barn and the house and pasture in the forefront belong to someone else. They're still in the Howe family, who actually built both of these barns and houses. And the farm that we're talking about is just on the other side of the road, the second house and barn, and the pasture beyond that, and actually that whole most of that forested land up that ridge that you can see in the photo here. Maggie, if you want to go to the next photo. These are just a few photos of the property, just to give a little bit of a sense, since we can't do a farm tour. So the property is about 200 acres total, with 45 acres already fenced in for pasture, and some of which is on prime agricultural soils. There is, if you want to go to the next slide, Maggie. So there's about 100 acres of forested land, and this photo shows part of that, what had been forested land. So about 30 acres of that 140 acres was cleared 6 years ago and has since begun to fill in with saplings and berry bushes, and other plants. And we'll talk a little bit more about plans for this part of the property as well as the pasture that I'm grazing right now. So this grazable land, the current pasture, the potential to make this into pasture was what was really most important to me when I first started thinking about this farm. But there is much more to this property, which is both a challenge and the opportunity that brought about this project. Maggie, if you want to go to the next slide. So here's a little bit closer up photo of the farm, and especially focused on the infrastructure. As Maggie mentioned, this had been a dairy farm up until it was just sold. And so there's pretty significant dairy infrastructure. There's old silos, a manure pit, concrete slab, concrete silage bunkers, and pretty significant and historic farms. So this a lot of this infrastructure is not really set up for raising other types of livestock. It's set up for dairy, and it's set up well for that, but it's not set up for beef cattle or sheep or pigs, which is what I raise. And this was a really big challenge in thinking about this property. So initially, this infrastructure kind of put a stop to me thinking about moving forward with this farm. Maggie and I actually had a number of conversations about, is there a way that I could purchase this even with, help from the land trust, working with the land trust, and the economics just didn't make sense for the combination of the amount of land in combination with this infrastructure, which, these barns are historic and they're beautiful, but they are a liability for a single farmer trying to make a living. There's a lot of maintenance required. There's a lot of work that needs to go into them. But I had also been involved in a number of community conversations about farm viability, land access, importance of farming in this community, need for community gathering space, and other things that might support the farming community. And I thought, along with my mom, we thought that there might be a possibility for something more to happen here. The big piece, I'm just actually, Maggie, if you want to go to the next slide, this shows a little bit more of this big, beautiful barn. And when you walk into this barn, this just has this big, beautiful open space with these gambrel, these rafters inside. And so walking into this, it just felt like this is a space that could be something more. This could be a community gathering space and an event space. And it needs to be preserved. And it felt like it should be, preserved as part of the community, not necessarily just something private that was going to be sold to someone else and no one would be able to have access to. So that was something that felt really important to me thinking about this farm. And so we brought this germ of an idea to Fran and Sarah initially, just to start really thinking about it. And as a group, we started putting together the pieces one by one, bringing Vermont Land Trust back into the conversation about this bigger idea. We're still very much in the early process of this farm. We've only been, this whole conversation about this bigger project just started about a year ago. So we're still very much in process, but that's kind of how the pieces started to come together. And then just a little bit about some of the things about this barn. As I said, I mentioned the potential uses that we envision here. We did actually have an initial engineering assessment of these barns, which was very positive, and we're working on getting a full engineering assessment to start really understanding the full possibilities. And then I'll pass this back to Fran so she can talk a little bit more about other pieces of this project and the legal structure, some of how all these pieces have come together between Vermont Land Trust and the Wet River Land Collaborative and myself as a farmer here and future land collaborators.
Thank you so much, Shona. Yeah, so as Shona said, I'm going to get into some of the legalities regarding the project and our partnership with VLT and next steps. So again, as Shona said, we started speaking with VLT as soon as we began looking at the farm, because VLT already owned a conservation easement on much of the cleared land, the pasture and the farmstead. It's about 60 acres of the 200-acre property. And at the time, we really couldn't see how we could possibly raise the money needed to purchase the property in the time frame that Corey and Ann, the previous farmers, needed. Thankfully, VLT believed in our vision and purchased the property and gave us, the White River Land Collaborative, a 5-year lease with an option to purchase the land at the appraised value, which was $650,000. Just an important side note here is that the farmers who owned the property were asking more than the land appraised at, and we very much wanted to make the finances work for them. It was really important to us. And we had been talking with Norwich Solar Technologies, which is a local community-oriented solar company, about putting a solar array on some of that cleared forested section of the property that Shona showed earlier. And I'll talk more about that project, the solar, in a bit, but the important point here is that we were able to get the landowners an additional $50,000 above the appraised value by having them enter into a leasehold option agreement with the solar company that gave the solar company the option to build the solar array. And then VLT assumed that option as new owners of the property and will assume it when we buy the property. It was just really important to us that the farmers receive a price that helped make them whole. And one other side note, we received critical community support when the Alliance for Vermont Communities, a local nonprofit, agreed to fiscally sponsor us so that we could accept charitable donations towards the purchase of the land and so that we could enter into this lease agreement with VLT. And as you can see in the diagram, we sublease a portion of the farm to Shona's business, Flying Dog Farm, and we also sublease the residents on the farm to Shona and her partner and a few local farm workers. Next slide, please, Maggie. So our plan is to add additional land-based enterprises as collaborator lessees in the barn. Once it's renovated, there's that top beautiful level that we are hoping for a community event space. And then there's a lot of space on a middle level in the 140 acres of forest and on a small amount of acreage available for vegetable production. And we're also looking at the possibility of subdividing the residents to be able to offer more housing. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit in the weeds on the legal, but bear with me, I'm a lawyer. As I mentioned earlier, when we create our own independent nonprofit, we plan to be a community land trust holding ag land. And we're exploring the various possibilities for legal structures to eventually hold and manage the land and operations. And we're looking at whether to separate the land holding entity, 501c2 in this diagram, which would hold the land and manage the agricultural operations, from the charitable parent, which would, that's the C3, which would manage all the charitable educational operations on the farm. And we'll have more to say about that later in 2022. Next slide, please. So I think this slide is a little teeny, but a few exciting things that I want to point out that we're doing in 2022. We are hiring a part-time staff person, which will just be an enormous boost for our all-volunteer project team. A generous donor gave us a matching gift in 2021, and then local community members raised the rest of the funds necessary for us to be able to hire someone. And that donor has also given us another matching gift for next year. So as long as we raise the funds to match it, that position is funded through 2023. Real briefly, I mentioned we're being fiscally sponsored by the end of May. We plan to file the paperwork necessary to become our own charitable organization. And then finally, as Shona mentioned, we hope to turn the big barn into the community event space and working space. And so by the spring, we should have the full engineering assessment that we need to renovate and create that space. Next slide, please. So you saw this slide a little bit earlier. These are the things that we're doing. Two projects that I really wanted to point out in particular that we're just so excited about. The first is led by our advisory board member, Emily Bowles. Emily is a local young Abenaki student of environmental science. And I want to describe the project in her words. So the White River Land Collaborative Forest Project aims to combine Indigenous knowledge and modern conservation practices to create a balanced form of land stewardship that will allow the ecosystem to not only persist, but flourish in light of past degradation and future climate change, so that this land can continue to support native species and human connections to place. This will be achieved through reintroducing native plant species, especially those of value to the Abenaki and ecosystem, managing invasive species, and creating land access equity. So through this project, Emily's leading really the building of social and cultural bridges in addition to planting things. We're learning a lot from her about Indigenous ways of relating to and caring for land, and I'm so excited to see where this project takes us. And then second, just as I mentioned earlier, we are integrating solar energy into the project. We did enter into that agreement with Norwich Solar. They have submitted all of the paperwork necessary to build a 500 kilowatt solar array, and they hope to receive the necessary certificate of public good this summer, begin construction next spring, which will generate much needed renewable energy for the town of Tunbridge. So that's a win-win for all. Partly, we are, in addition to the $50,000 that the former farmer landowners got, we get a small lease payment for 25 years, and that helps with our plan for self-sustainability. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm just going to spend a minute talking about my favorite topic, fundraising. VLT has been instrumental to our project, purchasing the property and giving us time to raise the funds that we need to buy the land. And we hope to be able to purchase the property from VLT by the end of 2023. So we began fundraising just last summer. I'm excited to report that through the last 6 months of 2021, we raised almost $200,000, with 110,000 of that raised towards our capital campaign to buy the land. So over the next 2 years, we need to raise another $600,000 or so to purchase the land and pay the associated costs. We've been talking with interested donors. We've had really good early success. We're interested in partnering with donors to move the project forward. So if you or anyone you know is interested in learning more about this project as a contributor, please be in touch. I'd love to talk. Next slide, please. Key to the success of this project has been the just significant support we've received from our local community. People through the region are thrilled that ownership of this historic farm is staying in the community and that farming will continue to be supported. To make this innovative, equitable model be successful, we need many hands. This picture is of a work day that we recently had on the farm. Fun, labor intensive, cleaning out the barn. We will have more of those days. So next steps for you are contributing, joining our mailing list, reaching out to learn more, come to our events. We'll let you know about work days. We'll definitely do some farm tours in the spring. Next slide, please. So that's where we are. As you can see, and as Shona said, we've really just begun, but we feel strongly that we have a good vision and great partners, including VLT. We also have a really strong advisory board made up of just some amazing Vermont institutions and people, leaders at NOFA Vermont, Farm to Plate, Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, Vital Communities, Preservation Trust of Vermont, White River Partnership, the Intervale Center, Emily and Jen Hazlett Coaching and Consulting are all just incredible advisors in supporting our efforts. So please reach out. My contact information and the team's contact information are on these slides. The slide is pretty teeny, but fmiller@vermontlaw.edu or White River Land Collaborative @gmail. And I'm sure that VLT will pass along any message as well. So thank you so much, everybody. And I'm going to turn it back to Maggie.
Thanks, Shona. Thanks, Fran. So yeah, we have some time now for some question and answer. And I think any of us are available for that. So you can see that there's a Q&A option as attendees for folks to put Q&A in there. If you want to put them in the chat, that's fine as well. Just a little bit about, I don't know if folks were looking at the chat while we were talking, but there was some great back and forth going on about some of the folks who designed and built the barns. So it sounds like Sylvester and Walter Howe. And it's just really interesting. Yeah, the kind of the history that it seems like is being uncovered. Fran, Shona, I don't know if you have anything else to say about that. I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at the chat while you were talking, but it seems like maybe we have like some folks who are related on here and maybe didn't know that. So that's fun. That's a fun little addition.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we have been in conversation with a number of different members of the Howe family. And one of the things that has been, first of all, really exciting is to have support of many members of the Howe family in this project. That was something that is important to us from the beginning. And of course, one of the goals of this project is to kind of celebrate what they have built and put into this land from the beginning. And we have been learning a lot about that history as we go in this project.
I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen. Hopefully everybody had a chance to look at the contact information, and maybe we can turn to some of these questions. So Diana has a question, which I think is a really, really awesome one, and I'm interested to hear both of your answers to this about. So how does this model make it possible for the young farmer, and I guess the young farmer in this case is you, Shona, or others who might be on the land, and I think other farmers who will also find themselves in similar situations. So how do they make it possible to retire when old? Has the farmer built equity to sell in order to fund retirement?
I can start answering this question, and Fran might have some thoughts from other work she's done. This, like many things, is something we are still working on figuring out. We don't have a 100% answer yet. I think, things that we have talked about are, investments that I make in things like infrastructure are investments that I would be able to recoup when I, sell my lease option or sell my lease. There be some structure which we have to develop that would allow me to sell my lease when I retire or for another reason decide to stop farming, and that any of investments I make, especially in buildings, I would be recouping that investment. Something I think we've kind of talked a little bit about is thinking about what, how to measure investments made in the land and the quality of pasture and other land, and how do we maybe account for that? It's hard to give a monetary value to that, but is that something that we give a monetary value to at some point? And I think another piece, which can also be a little hard to completely measure, is that, there is value to me in not having to be paying the cost of a mortgage and some of the big overheads of, costs that would be associated with maintaining these barns. So at least in theory, I would be able to be investing my income, money, capital into the business or other things in ways that are going to produce more and allow me to save in different ways than if I was, putting that into the farm and then trying to sell the farm at the end. So definitely a very important question and something we have a lot more work to do on.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, I think that it might also be that things are different now than they used to be, and that farmers used to be able to buy a piece of land and it was maybe more affordable, and then at the end of their careers sell it and recoup that investment and go somewhere else if they wanted to. And now it feels different given the cost of land, especially for people without a big down payment or a lot of capital to start. So it's hard. I don't even know that it's possible to build the equity that is assumed in that question, which I totally get the assumption that's kind of been how it's been. It's also the case that farmers now retiring are having a hard time figuring out how to recoup their investment without leaving the land.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they've been living in the same place for years and years and years, and they don't necessarily want to sell and leave. So that's a difficult position as well. But, you know, as Shona says, these are the things that we're struggling with and talking about and figuring out.
Thanks you both. Yeah, I think like as the farming community or subset of the farming community desires these like quote unquote, you know, alternative structures, I think that's one of those questions, is sort of the way in which this system has normally functioned, like figuring out all those pieces of it. So a couple of questions, I'm going to kind of combine these because I think they're relevant. So maybe sharing like how many other land stewards or farmers you anticipate being able to support, and maybe in that also just talking about what kinds of products you envision seeing on the property, both what you produce, Shona, and then what else you think could be supported.
Shona, you want to start with that one?
Sure. So yeah, I don't know that we have a set number of land stewards that we envision. It's not a huge property. It is a sizable property, but it's not necessarily something where we could envision, another livestock enterprise, for example. There isn't enough pasture for something like that. It's not something where we envision, dividing it all up into small parcels. I think what we see as the most likely possibilities is there is a small amount of prime ag land, small acreage that could be used for vegetable crops, maybe a few acres, kind of market garden, or in collaboration, in connection with another property, or perennial herbs, or some other, wouldn't necessarily have to be vegetables. We are interested in seeing the possibilities, or seeing if there's interest for other people to start enterprises more agroforestry related, potentially, if there's potential for someone to do something with maple sugaring. There might be other crops, agroforestry or other crops that could be integrated in the pasture that would be mutually beneficial. And then the big thing that we see fitting in really well is use of infrastructure in part of the historic barn. So potentially food processing infrastructure, like whether that's a kitchen or whether it's a different type of infrastructure, and shared cold storage. Those are things that we see that would fit really well with the infrastructure there's already there. We have talked with people who are doing work with converting parts of dairy farms, especially old manure pits, to different aquaculture enterprises. So that might be a potential down the road. That's something we don't know a lot about, but we'd be interested to learn more about. So that might give you a little sense of the products. Right now, I raise all my products are mostly meat, but also might include, sheepskins. I'm looking at leather products and other products that will really use the whole animal. And one of the things that we are starting to develop is a potential for is a farm store space, which could serve land stewards that are operating on this land and potentially other farmers in the area. We kind of have to see how that would work, but that's something we're interested in as well. How can we serve not just people who are using this land, but also other farmers and land stewards in the area?
Yeah, I guess I would just also add that we see this as our first piece of property that is part of this commons, and that we are hopeful that there could be additional land that might be part of the commons. And there's also other land down the valley that might be able to be leased for other land stewards that might join our collaborative. It's a great question, and we are also thinking about this and working on it.
Yeah, and then I think, so we have about 4 more minutes. I think the last 2 questions are also somewhat related, but this question around sort of historical, you know, in the history of the property and involvement from the community in either like a local historical society, or if you've thought about how, to what extent the family history and the heritage in the property could be preserved or has been preserved. I've seen a little bit of that happening. You have the beginnings, right, of like a little sort of history space going. So
Fran, you want to answer that? Do you want me to speak to that?
Why don't you start? I'll add.
Okay. So I think there's a couple of things that are kind of in development. I don't know specifically about what the, you know, tours or there is a local Tunbridge Historical Society, and actually Elaine Howe, who I believe Sylvester Howe was her grandfather, great grandfather. Someone Gus might be able to answer that more accurately. Has been really involved, has been talking to us a lot about some of the family history, and is part of the local historical society. So we've been working with her to understand a little bit about that history. One of the things we've talked about is there is one of the buildings here is an old English barn. It didn't come up in any of these photos, but that actually predates all of these other barns. And that's a building that we've looked and talked with the Preservation Trust of Vermont about maybe that would be a building that we would really work on preserving, in the sense of like a kind of capital P preservation, preserving just as it is or as it was, and that could be a space where we can really showcase some of that history. And I think both, it's kind of important to acknowledge both sharing the history of the Howe family who put so much into this land, and also history prior to them. And you know, one of the things that we've been talking about with Emily and we've been thinking about is really wanting to also share Abenaki history on this land. So I think that's an important piece of that as well. I think we would love to have more conversations with anyone in the Howe family that's interested in, to have, you know, be part of that conversation of what's most important to them on this land, and how can we best celebrate that and preserve it as we continue to, you know, adapt some buildings for different uses and adapt some different uses of the land.
That's good. I don't have to add anything to that.
yeah, it sounds
Suzanne,
like
actually, Suzanne had this line that was something like, we're honoring and acknowledging the breadth of the history of this property, which includes both the Howe family and the Abenaki people who were earlier.
Yeah, and some nice appreciation there from Gus in the chat. So if anybody on this call is part of the Tunbridge Historical Society, it sounds like, you know, be in touch. There could be some really cool collaboration that goes on there. So so we're just about at time. It's 7:59. So we'll wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone, for your good questions and for the liveliness in the chat. It was really awesome to be here, and appreciate everybody taking an hour out of their night to be in front of the computer. And we'll be sending a follow-up survey, as well as an opportunity to sign up for the White River Land Collaborative email list. So look at your email inboxes for that. Anything else I'm missing, Maya?
I don't think so. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. And we'll be sending you that email shortly.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Have a good
Happy
night.
Hey, everyone.
Talk to you. Bye.